Hello, everyone. Hello. Good afternoon. Welcome to City Forum. It's our second City Forum speaker series for this semester. Today we are so honored to have Ms. Susana Renteria
Almanza
to give us a talk on CodeNEXT. But before we start, I'd like to introduce her to you by reading her brief bio. Susana Renteria Almanza is a founding member and director of PODR, P-O-D-R, which is a grassroots environmental social justice organization. Susana has overcome poverty, prejudice, and segregated schools to face some of the world's most powerful transnational corporations. Susana is an indigenous person and resides in East Austin, Texas. She is a longtime community organizer, educator, mother, and grandmother. Susana participated in the civil rights movement as a Brown Beret, taking up issues of police brutality, housing, quality education, and equity in school systems and healthcare as a right, not a privilege. She is a proven leader in nationally recognized environmental justice activism. So let's welcome Susana.
Thank you. Thank you. I don't know if the mic's on. Hello. It's on? Oh, no, his mic. Oh, you can hear me?
Yep.
Can everyone hear me? Okay. Well, thank you so much. I want to thank the Community Regional Planning Department for giving me the opportunity to discuss. As he says, I'm a native of East Austin. I was born and reared here, and I've seen a lot of major changes. And I just want to say up front, I'm not a planner, but I have been impacted by many plans. Okay, and so what I want to do is just give you a brief history. We've also passed out a single sheet. These are policies that they're being worked on by Poder belongs to a coalition called the Eastern Crescent Right to Stay Coalition. And so we're working on policies that we want to implement on CodeNEXT. And so one of the things I'll be doing after I finish my presentation is asking you to, as you look at those policies, is to give suggestions on how we might implement those policies. And so that'll be the second part that will go as soon as I finish the presentation, is then go into those. And then we've also passed out a timeline, the gentrification timeline, and different land use and policies that were used to continue to displace communities of color. And I'll go through some of those, but they will be very briefly. That particular brochure has a little bit more extensive, even though there's a lot more that could go on there, but we'll at least give you a snapshot of the different land use and policies that have been used to displace communities of color. So the city of Austin, has they're associated with a long history of racism that has displaced our communities, and we feel that that is a discussion that needs to be had before we start the discussion of CodeNEXT. One of the things that we see in that plan is that the land development planning has fostered the wealth, safety, and security of affluent and middle-class white residents, while really ignoring communities of color. So that history is deep-rooted in Austin, and it is a history that favors the interests of developers, the Austin Real Estate Council, the Chamber of Commerce, Austin Board of Realtors, Home Builders Association, Greater Austin, while failing to provide those same things for communities of color, from stopping the flooding in our communities, from the unsafe streets, from the inadequate access to healthy foods, to the inadequate funding of education, through all of the different things that impacts communities, substandard housing, and ultimately gentrification of our communities. So in the 14th Amendment that was passed after the Civil War prohibit the slavery of African Americans. In general, stop treating African Americans as second-class citizens. And the 14th Amendment also provided that people were to be treated fairly and equally. But in Austin, what happened was that that wasn't the case. So you had Austin saying, you know, we have a lot of settlements. In those days, if you were African American or Mexican, you were more steered to the settlements of St. John's, Mount Toplius, and Clarksville. And those were part of the city that weren't really incorporated into the city just then. So that is where people of color were being steered. But in 1922, Congress passed the State Standard Zoning Enabling Act. That particular act gave cities throughout the whole United States to start their segregation plans. And Austin then took the run and started its 1928 master plan. And in that master plan, it wanted to begin the movement of African Americans that were in West Austin that live in Wheatsville and Clarksville. And they knew they couldn't use zoning as one of the tools back then because there would be a constitutional challenge to those tools. So what Austin did was it said it was segregated in the West Side, the African American schools, parks, and libraries. So they closed them all down. They said, well, you know what, we'll just close down the services and they'll have no services out here. And what they'll have to do, so how do we get them to move where there's a small African American population in East Austin? And so what they began to do is that they said, well, we're going to build the African American schools, the parks, and the libraries, and the first all-black public housing, Rosewood Courts in East Austin, that will push them to relocate to East Austin. And so the city helped create the Negro District in East Austin to begin that segregation plan that was headed at the federal level and now going down to the different states, to the different municipalities in order to do that. So from the 1870s, and then after that is that from the 1870s to the 1940s, the Mexican Americans were actually downtown where you see City Hall. Actually, that square, which many of you might know, it's called a Republic Square. It's off of Guadalupe 2nd and 3rd and 4th Street, was actually considered the Mexican Square. And you would see that there were business and the Mexican population actually lived, again, in West Austin in the downtown area. But what happened was that area flooded a lot, but when they fixed the Mansfield Dam and the Longhorn Dam, then that helped escalate the property appraisals and thus began the relocation of the Mexican American communities to East Austin, and they created the Mexican American public housing called the Santa Rita Courts in order to help in that relocation to East Austin. And there were other policies that they were using, other policies in ordinance to keep people of color. So you'll see here in Hyde Park, if you look on the first bullet point, it says Hyde Park is strictly for white people. So not only did they do deed restrictions, they used all of these different policies so that as they began to segregate the city, if you were a person of color, you would have to live in East Austin. And so that's how other policies that are not actually zoning, but there's policies that they did. But in 1957, what they did was they developed the Industrial Development Plan. And so that in that color that you see purple they blanket zoned all of East Austin industrial. And what they use is what they call the term cumulative zoning. So under cumulative zoning, you could build houses in the industrial zoning. But if you were zoned single family, like in West Austin, you could not build any industrial, anything higher above single family. So what they actually did was protect West Austin and put everything that they didn't want, along with people of color, in East Austin. And this cumulative zoning was in place until 1987. So it hasn't been that long that they had this particular policy in place. And then in 1956, they passed the Highway Act. And so that Highway Act was used to begin to segregate communities even further. That's why when you hear people say you either live on the other side of the highway or the other side of the railroad tracks, because those are actually plans that they made. And that was one way that they used to say, well, that's where, you know, the blacks or the Mexican lives, and that's little shanty towns or whatever. But if we build a highway through there, that's one way to displace all those people. Again, there was a perception that was seen at that particular time. And in Austin, of course, Highway 35 was built, and that created the physical barrier and the further deepening of the segregation of East versus West when that came along. The other highway they built was Mopac. Mopac then, even though they had removed most of the African American population, there were still some there. Mopac was like the next highway to remove the last standing few that were still living there. And then what came in next was the other gentrification tool that came in was urban removal. Urban removal came in the 1960s and 1970s. All you have to do is go down 11th Street and 12th Street, and you can see what happened. We would call urban renewal urban removal because we saw what was happening. And what they did was they hired consultants to sum and blight our entire communities and erased everybody and used eminent domain to steal the land. We started with stealing the land because the people did not get a just compensation for their property. And that is how the African and Mexican American community was relocated. I actually lived on 10th Street. So 11th Street was the next farm over. I actually live on 10th Street, was where the Mexican American community ended. I crossed the street and it was where the African American community began. And so I really got to live and see a lot of these injustices that were happening. As I was growing up, our streets were not paved, we did not have drainage. All of these things are lighting. All of these things did not exist in our communities, but the moment we crossed the highway, it was a very different picture of what we saw. And then of course, in 1999, the East Cesar Chavez neighborhood plan was passed. And if you may know, what the city did was they developed neighborhood plans, and they divided the city into 54 neighborhood districts. And then they said each neighborhood would begin to plan and what they wanted in their community. And I can tell you that was a lot of BS, because that's not what happened. As you began to, you sit in those meetings and you thought, oh, really, I would like to have a store there, a post office, and doctors, and all of this. It was nothing. It made you think that you were given 2 or 3 years of your life for planning your neighborhood, when the bottom line, when you got to city council, it said in the print that it was, none of the suggestions were legally binding. The only thing that was legally binding was zoning. And so what they had done is they had rezoned our communities and using new zoning designations as commercial services mixed use. And so what happened in that commercial services mixed use, this is the Cesar Chavez neighborhood plan boundaries. Well, according to a UT study that they did of the area, they saw an escalation of appraisal price, right? So they did a study looking from 1998 to 2004, in just those years after the adoption of the neighborhood plan, and they found that the property values had increased, the land value had increased 400% plus. The property taxes had increased 123 percent for the community. So the East Cesar Chavez neighborhood plan opened the floodgates to gentrification by the adoption of this particular plan. And then we go into what the city did in 2010. It adopted the Riverside Corridor Master Plan. It has these things about mastering, you know, in there all the time, because it trumps neighborhood plans. Even though the Riverside Corridor Plan goes through the Montopolis community, and we said, hold them up, they have to come before us according to the neighborhood plan process when you're changing a zoning, and we're not having that discussion before our contact team. And they said, well, it's a master plan, it trumps your neighborhood plan. Therefore, you don't get the right to say you don't want this particular zoning in your community, so it's going to be done. So when the Riverside Corridor Plan was done, the master plan, it was administered as if Riverside was vacant, as if no one lived on Riverside. What happened after that institution of that Riverside Corridor Plan? 1,700 people, the poor and the working poor, mostly communities of color, were displaced to make room for high density, higher class earners along the Riverside Corridor. And then we look at what they did. How did they protect themselves from policies and designation? They designated West Austin the water protection zone. Therefore, it would limit certain developments, what could and could not go there. But they designated East Austin. You see the different levels of desired development zone. And to do that, they use all types of policies and incentives, reduction in certain fees for all projects within the desired development zone. You know, they would do potential fee waivers, infrastructure improvement for projects if you went to East Austin. They would reduce the cost of extending major wastewater lines if you moved to the desired development zone. It was like when I told you when they said, how do we move the African Americans from Wheatsville to Clarksville? How do we get them to establish this stuff? The same techniques were more modern tools that they're using to displace and gentrify communities of color. So that's just giving you a snapshot. So then what we did as a coalition member of the Eastern Crescent Right to Stay Coalition, we start working on policies of the CodeNEXT is right now being rewritten, right? And so one of the policies we say is they need to acknowledge the racist history of its land development codes and their consequences on Austin's communities of color. 2, we need to delay the adoption of any land development code changes until the changes have been evaluated by a racial equity tool for their potential impacts on communities of color. 3, we need to prioritize the voices of communities that have been most negatively impacted by historical land use practices in Austin as it considers changing to the code. 4, preserve and expand all of the existing public participation processes for implemented zoning and land development code. Redefine affordability for the poor, 0 to 30% median family income, and working poor, 31 to 60% MFI. Articulate our commitment to implement a land development code that is fair and just, that eliminates institutional barriers to equity. Tie any changes to the land development code to solutions for Austin's affordability crisis and to policies that prevent displacement, provide reparation and relocation for people of color and other vulnerable communities, preserve existing and expand construction of affordable homes for working poor families, prohibit development that increases flooding, traffic, property taxes, and decreases affordability and causes displacement. And lastly, eliminate the desired development zone designated in East Austin. And so those are some ongoing policies that we are developing to look at the whole issue of CodeNEXT as is rewrite. If you might not know, September the 15th was the second draft of CodeNEXT that just came out, and there'll be a series of town hall. They're not meetings, they set them up and they do little posters, and you can come in and see what's happening. And so you might have the chance to talk to the different people at the different stages to ask them questions. So in looking at these policies that I've sent out, we handed out to you, what I'd like to do is that we've kind of defined or looked at those policies, but now the third stage was, how do you implement those policies? How do you get them implemented? And one of the things we're saying is that you have to make sure that you institute these policies before the land development code is adopted. You'll hear the council members or the mayor says, well, the land development code is broken, so we need to fix it, and then we'll look at the policies. And we're saying, no, you need to institute the policies first and then adopt, you know, the CodeNEXT. And you have to make sure you're now presently looking at developing the equity tools. I think they're almost finished. So why don't you look at the land development code through an equity lens before you develop those tools? So what I like now to take is, if you've had a chance to look at those policies, and we've handed them out to you and you can write them, but I'd like to see is what would be some suggestions that you might have to implement these policies, and you can tell me which one you would like to, that you're interested in, or your suggestion to that. Like, for instance, let's look at the first one: acknowledge the racist history of a land development code and its consequences of communities of color. One thing they could do is they could issue a proclamation stating the wrong that they did, sort of like a public apology to communities of color. That would be, how do you implement that particular policy? Or you could write a paragraph when you write a little history in the land development code of all the past wrongs that were done to communities of color, and how the new land development code is now going to bring in a real society and not a segregated society. How do we make those changes? Put that in. So that's a suggestion, just to kind of give you a couple of examples. And so for right now, I would like to take anyone that might have a suggestion. You know, I'd like to hear your suggestion. Yes?
I have a question.
Okay.
I was wondering if you could talk a little more about the racial equity tools that they're going to be using, maybe what those look like? Or?
Well, only briefly, and I don't know of anyone here that might be following it more closely. I've gone to a couple of the meetings, but anyway, so what they'll do is that each department, if there's a program or a project, they look on what's the impact of that particular program or project, or, you know, zoning. If you would look at this, you know, how does it impact communities of color? How does it benefit? If you look at a lot of cities who have neighborhood benefits programs, and so they set separate tools. Or you could look at it, okay, how many in this particular area you have 10 multifamily you know, programs or projects, right? And this particular area has none. So is that equitable then to put another multifamily project there? Have they exceeded the amount? So sort of like the tools that they're building on before something is accepted. And if you don't have a comment right now, I also have an email on there. So if you want to send in a suggestion, please do send it. If you have a question, I'm willing to take a question too. Yes?
What type of representation do y'all have in city council in terms of the neighborhoods of color?
Well, you know, for the first time in history since a single member district came about in 2015, we actually have 4 people of color on the city council. But that doesn't mean, it's like the school board. Right. We had a majority, and still we have the worst education and schools closing in East Austin. That doesn't really mean, because I think what happens is that if you don't have a real strong unifying force to make changes, it's not going to happen. So I think you have to really have some real aggressive, progressive people of color there. There have been some changes, but I don't think that they've been looked through the equity lens or to people of color, because you'll see that there's only one councilman there, a person of color that's actually from East Austin or the community. Everybody's else from a different state and a different city. So if you don't have the historic background, or you don't really study it and you don't get out into the community, it's kind of hard to understand what's really happening on the ground to a lot of the communities of color. So community engagement is very important. Yes.
So I had a question about, is it quota? Is that how to?
It's poder, and actually means power or empowerment in Spanish.
So I was wondering what kind of leverage you guys have, because I feel like the suggestions would kind of work on how much people will listen to you, who's going to listen. So
No.
who are in Poder, and where do they come from?
Well, just about all of the Poder people are natives of East Austin, and that's what I think it's more power-based. And Poder itself is its board of directors is made of 7 neighborhood associations. So we don't look like lawyers or accountants. We look at the community-based empowerment, and we ask the chairs or the presidents of those neighborhoods to be part of our board, so that we can keep a pulse on what's happening in their communities. And so it's more of an indigenous concept, sort of like the tribes and the council of people talking together and trying to bring about changes. We were successful in adopting the East Austin Overlay Ordinance, which when the neighborhood plans came about got erased. But that was the first time in the adoption of that policy that developers actually had to sit at the table with communities of color, and we could actually lobby whether we wanted to accept their zoning change of their project, or we could say we could compromise and make changes, or we could say no, we're not going to accept them. So that East Austin overlay gave us a lot of opportunities. We also had our first council, Raul Alvarez actually came from Poder, and he was actually elected to city council when we were able to make a lot of changes to actually close down the Holly power plant and to look at the different impacts, the zoning impacts that were happening in our community. When Councilman Gus Garcia was there, we were in the mid-90s to late, we were able to get the land use studies done to show that all of the industrial zoning was in our community, that we weren't just speaking to speak, but actually got it mapped, analyzed, and then they went, wow, we didn't realize. They knew it, but you know, when you map it and you GIS and everything, then it's true, it really is real. And so we were able to begin the process of closing down some of the hazardous facilities. We made history with the Go Valley Johnson plan. We rezoned over 600 properties in that area that were not compatible because we had industry, you know, next to schools, next to people, hazardous things. We still have them because the city grandfathered, even though we were able to rezone a lot of the properties, the city grandfathered them, and so they can remain until they close or sell. And right now we have pure casting that uses a lot of different chemicals. It's right across the street from Zavala Elementary and next to the preschool playground, which we have been trying to relocate or do an equity land swap, get the city to do an equity land swap with them because it doesn't belong there in the community. But see, it's very hard because it's like children of color are not given the same value, but to me, all children are sacred. But it's been a long battle, and we've been fighting that battle for about 7 years now of trying to get pure casting relocated. And so if the city, and that's why I said, if you don't have strong people on the city council, or you don't have other members that don't just care about your district, because you vote on everything citywide, you can step out of your district to help a poor district. And I think that a lot of that is also lacking in the city council members. Yes?
Do you have any experience using historic preservation tools like local historic district building to fight development?
Yeah, that's a real interesting story that actually what was happening in my neighborhood where I grew up, they were actually carving out a historic district. But here was the impacts. Because when people of color lived in those so-called historic districts, they weren't historic. But the moment we were displaced and whites moved into those homes, they became historic. But what happened was, it was like the White House had moved into our communities, because those houses got appraised like at $300,000 or $400,000, and the homes there were at $20,000 to $30,000. So it jacked up everybody's property taxes like quadruple in the area. So we thought, oh my God, it's one thing to preserve the homes. Plus they were getting a tax break, but what was it doing to the communities that were not zoned historic, right? And so I always look at it like this double-edged sword, right? Because I felt like, you knew historic, why didn't you do it when we were living in those homes? Why didn't you come and give us those tools and help us or whatever, right? And then, so right now, we got a lot of that change, but you know, I agree with a lot of the historic zoning. So the city got the money a couple of years ago and is looking in the Cesar Chavez plan at looking at historic homes, because a lot of those, since Cesar Chavez was the first one to do the adopted neighborhood plan, a lot of the homes have been destroyed. And so now they're in this process of trying to get them historic to preserve the homes, right? It's always such a slow process. By the time they do that, probably half the homes will be destroyed if you've gone through the Cesar Chavez. Basically everything that's there is gone. The first phase that came in was flipping the housing. They would come in, do a little cosmetic and raise and sell it for double the price. Now they're not even doing that. They're just bulldozing the homes and putting up, you know, 2 or 3 townhomes there, and it's nothing that looks compatible, you know, in the community. So there's a lot of things to look at that whole historic zoning, and I think it's how do you sustain the people that are there in place if you use those historic tools, but how do you sustain them and not make it like a tax benefit or profits for somebody else to come in. We definitely are right now in the battle, which I'm glad to say we're just about succeeded in preserving the Negro school in Montopolis at 500, and that's been a big battle in trying to preserve that particular school. It seems like we got the Planning Commission to zone the entire site historic and not just the building, as they were wanting to do and build townhouses and a restaurant. And it looks like the owner, Austin Stowell, has just agreed to sell it to the city. But it was a long battle, him refusing to recognize that it was a historic Negro school there and that we should preserve it, because a lot of that history has just been totally erased also. So, yeah. And yeah,
I'm interested in what alliances CodeNEXT has been working with in order to advance these things. Because I know some groups in Austin who advocate for affordability are allying more with the developers and the kind of NIMBY, like, I would mention, or like the like let's build more density, and others are kind of more the community commodity, like.
right,
And that actually is a lot more expensive neighborhoods like Boulder.
right.
So what
Well,
is your experience?
Well, part of that coalition that we're working with are a lot of the East Austin groups, but also a lot of the white groups. We do have members of Community Not Commodity. We have Undoing Racism. We're working with a lot of the environmental groups, SOS, Sierra Club. So that coalition is a lot bigger. And you're right, it's like when people were trying to change from a large system to single-member district. So you had one group, and then they had to align with the more the right-wing kind of groups, but they felt the same, but different reasons. But they wanted to go into so you have to make these alliances. We don't necessarily agree with Aura or Evolve because they're the new urbanists and they want to do away with single-family housing, which it's a big difference when it comes to communities of color, because that's the only mobility and the asset that we have. And if you want to erase our single-family homes that we have strived so hard to work for and to be able to pass that on to our children so that they will have some assets. I think they're not looking at the bigger picture of how these things could be done. And so you might have a group on this side that wants to preserve the status quo, but they're not in agreement with the land development code and you're not in agreement. So sometimes these strange allies. And so one of the things that we're currently working on is to do a referendum, is to get 20,000 signatures to put it on the ballot to try and stop the land development code so there'll be a more democratic process so that people are involved. Right now, it's only the staff and the consultants that are really writing the new land development code. That's like writing the Constitution of our city. And so I think we should have more of a voice, especially the coalition we have is a coalition for communities of color and people of color because we have been left out of the table. And so we're trying to make sure that we have a seat at the table and that we have a voice at the table. And so that's sort of the coalition, and with white allies that understand that and see the importance of it. So it's a pretty big group, and we're aligning ourselves with a lot of communities throughout the city. Yes.
You said in the beginning that you weren't a planner. Do you have any planners in your groups or whom you're working with for helping out understand the code?
Well, yes, we do have several planners, but I'm really pleased that this semester I have 4 interns working with me here from the University of Texas, and I have Celine Rendon that's right there, and Laura Cuervo, she's back in the back, and Katie is right here, and then Caroline Hager. So I have a lot of good people that are on working as interns, but we also have Raul Alvarez is part of our Go Valley Johnston contact team, and so he received his master's. Like I said, he was on city council, and so he has from regional planning. Then we have some business people that are on that do development. They're developers that are on our team also, and so we align ourselves with like Mark Rogers with the Go Valley with the Guadalupe Neighborhood Corporation that does affordable housing. So we try to align ourselves too with people who have that understanding and who have maybe that development viewpoint of how do you provide for families and working families and poor working families. There could be 2 people, but one is making minimum wage or just above minimum wage. How do you make sure that you provide? Because the way Austin is going more to, it's not family-based. And we come from a family-based culture, and that family-based culture, housing is being eliminated for the family-based culture. And you could see it within the Austin Independent School District, is they're underpopulated, and most of the schools in East Austin, and if you were to look further, that would be where the gentrification. We used to have a 19% African-American population, we're down to 5%. So when you look at those particular things that are happening, and you began to see how our neighborhoods are being gentrified, and that you have only individuals, or you have individuals with cats and dogs, that's really good, but they can't go to school. If they did that, they would be overpopulated, because I see them, I think all of our community, we see that. But, so we don't have that family-based culture, sustaining family-based culture in our communities. All the children and people having to move so far out because it's so unaffordable. And the school system is really feeling it. Not only the school system, the religious institutions are feeling it too, because they're losing their population too, that come and give to the local churches. And all you have to do is go to the local churches and see how many cars and trucks are there, because people are driving in who don't want to leave the parishes that they had always devoted themselves to. They're having to drive a long way to come back in to do those things, whereas people used to just walk to their local churches and their local groceries. So there's been a big change in how zoning and land use, they look at it, I say they look at it in a form of math and figures, their side backs and their impervious coverage and their height, but they don't look at it through humanity. How do you look at land use? How does that impact humanity? How does that impact families? If you're only going to build studios and 1 bedrooms, how does that impact families if that's all you're doing? And if you're going to high price them so high, how is that going to impact the low wage earners, and where are they going to live? And so I think that those are the things that we're trying to get the city to look at, and people, not just the city, getting everyone to look at it. Let's look at it through an equity lens, and let's look at it through a justice lens, and not just look at it in the forms of numbers. But how do we change this racist history that's been allowed to go on and on? How do we change that so that we become a society where we all live and work together, and that we respect one another, and that we understand different cultures? And that's, to me, is real important. Your question.
I just had a question,
Mhm.
thinking through the equity lens about how so many policies have sort of targeted East Austin in a way, and thinking in reverse about how that's ended up protecting a lot of other areas of the city. So I was wondering if and I know that's obviously really challenging, but I was wondering if you guys ever go for policies about redistributing development across onto the other side, and not just about, because it always seems to be a catch-22 sometimes of, do you try and freeze things in place so that people can't come in and change it? But that's not to say that East Austin doesn't still need sidewalk improvements and help with flooding, but then if you improve things and you attract development. So then on the the flip side of that of saying, if you make, why is only East Austin so attractive to development? Because they put so many protections and barriers in the way in other parts of the city. So I was just curious if, I know I've seen like analysis of how affordable housing is unevenly distributed across the districts. I was wondering if you guys, is that a feasible way of thinking about it? Is each district sort of shouldering some part of the development and influx of people coming into the city?
Well, I think that that's one of the tools that the equity lens is actually looking at, is how do you make sure that there's a fair distribution of multifamily housing or duplexing, or more of a family base. How do you do that? Because that is real important. That's how you're going to change the segregation. Besides putting in other tools, because the other tools will have to be, how do you make sure that if you're going to move people of color into an all-white neighborhood, how do you make sure that those people are comfortable? How do you make sure that there's an education curriculum in the school that changes, that recognizes that there's different people with different cultures and celebrations, etc. So there's a whole kind of tool that has to come with that, that sort of like putting together a welcoming committee to embrace the people who come, and not to make them feel isolated or looked down upon because they're moving into the community. So I think that there is going to have to be a lot of changes, and there's a lot of people that don't want that change. They don't want people of color or low income or working class people living adjacent or anywhere near them. And I think that those kind of mindsets that have gone on have going to have to change if we really want to have, an open society where we're more accepting of different people with different languages. I go to other countries and they embrace that people speak 4 or 5 languages. They teach their children, they need to learn more than one language. And the United States is the only place that I know that doesn't want people and doesn't embrace people speaking so many different languages or celebrating, different cultures. And I found that, that really needs to change. And we've got to do it, because it's really, I really don't know the word for it, but it's really disheartening if that is to continue. If we're to continue this institutional racism, I think we're just going backwards instead of forward. Anyone else? Yes.
Do you know why East Austin was originally designated as the place where they put the DDZ zone?
Oh, well, because they're to protect the West Austin. So, and there had been a history already of putting blacks and browns in East Austin earlier.
West side, they sort of made them move to the east side?
Yes. So you have to look at geography. That's the other play. So when they came in and they actually, Montopolis was the area they wanted to put the capital and so forth because you're up on the hill, you know. But when you look at geography, which way does the water run? So the water runs from west to east. So you're going to have the wastewater coming down to the east side and so forth. So when they looked at planning the cities, they also looked at geography. And so they designated, oh, you don't want to live where all this trash or everything is going to come down to. So you want to live sort of like too on the the hilly plain and so forth. So they looked at all of these different things too. Like I said, downtown, it was acceptable to have the Mexican community there because it would flood at that time down there. But once they fixed the 2 dams, when they got there was no longer any flooding. So it was time to move the Mexican American community out of the downtown area. So they're always planning, you know, 10, 20, 30 years ahead if you look at city planning, because if some of you are in there, you're always looking ahead of how you're going to do it. As a matter of fact, in the late 1990s to 2000, they were already designating the new East Austin. They had a map, and in that mapping showed that East Austin would now begin east of Highway 183. So you already saw that all of us were going to be moved to the next highway, Highway 183. And you know that the city, you might not know, but the city got this big grant to look at Colony Park and look at the development out there. It's where it moved a lot of the housing from when they closed down Bergstrom Airport, affordable housing. So they look at all these strategies. Okay, how are we going to make that the new East Austin? Well, if you want a real affordable housing, you can't afford it, you know, really in this downtown urban, east of Highway 83 is going to be the cheapest place. That's a place you can still afford to live. But they also put you know, they already have the state jail there. So it's going to be there, you know. So they have a lot of things that are already there being waiting. So just like the East Austin had the 90% of the industrial zoning was in our community, a lot of that is already there or going there. And so it's just a continuation of the manifest destiny. I always said we lived in the urban reservation. You know, I lived in the urban reservation. I recognized that, and that once the Smart Growth Initiative, the planners decided that they were going to redevelop the urban core, and we were not at the table. We knew what was going to happen because we already knew what had happened to Clarksville and downtown. Our families came from that history, so we already knew that once that land, they fix it or develop it, and they want it, we're out of there. And so now we're like in East Austin in the urban reservation, and they've already moved out just about all the blacks, and now we're the next population to be drowned out. And that's why I said CodeNEXT could be the final nail on the coffin that drives us all out of the urban core in East Austin if we're not paying close attention and we're not looking at how that land development code is being rewritten. Yes?
Are there some specific things that could would like change in the current drafting of the code?
Yeah, you know, I hope you got a copy of the policies that were the beginning stage and looking at the policies. So we would like to have these policies sort of integrated at first before the land development code. In other words, we want the land development code to match these particular policies. And like I said, they're just the beginning, but those are things that we've come up with to match it before it gets adopted, instead of adopting the land development code and then try to bring in policies to fix those impacts. And so right now we're studying, the new draft just came out September the 15th. So at this point we're just looking at, we know there's new zoning, and basically a lot of that, it's mostly, a lot of the neighborhood plans, we've put down what we'd like to have. So we'd like to have the neighborhood plans also respected, but it looks like this here, again, might trump our neighborhood plans. And so there's a lot of studying and research that has to be done, but we do know that in the first draft, they had gotten rid of single family zoning. They had replaced it with the new zoning. And so it's sort of like, we'd like to keep that single-family designation. We'd like to stop the high densifying of our communities. We'd like to see more affordable housing, and we'd like to see ownership in apartments. If there's going to be apartments in multifamily, could there not be ownership instead of just rental? Could there, you know, because other states like in New York and Harlem, people own their apartments. How do you get that asset? So there's things that we'd like to see the city try and embrace before it just looks at just at the interests of developers and high densifying our communities. Because one of the things we know is that high density does not equal affordability, even though that is a model that the city has been pushing. The more units, then the cheaper it get. But believe me, there's no study or research that I've seen that proves that theory, that because you high densified, it became more affordable. If anything, it became less affordable. Mm-hmm.
The city of Boston did not have its master plan update in 4 decades until the recent one, the Imagine Austin. So when they worked on the Imagine Austin, did they work closely with your community?
Imagine Austin, if you actually looked at Imagine Austin and they looked at who participated, communities of color were not at the table in Imagine Austin. And when we were there to give input, it did not make it into it. So people say Imagine Austin is like Imagine Austin without people of color. Mm-hmm. That's what we call that plan. We always have our own names for all the plans. Like urban renewal. Imagine Austin with no people of color. So yeah, so it's a continuation. So we do need to make sure that as people become, you know, planners and stuff, I would just ask for all the time to look at things through an equity and a just lens when you're looking at stuff. And I know we have had some, when we worked on the Gold Valley Johnson plan, we bucked heads with some of the top department heads that were helping with that plan. And then after a year of fighting and going through all the different boards and commissions and filing complaint, they gave us 2 new planners, Steve Rossiter and Ricardo Solis. And now they had an equity kind of lens, and we went through parcel by parcel, visiting, looking at their use and looking at what they could be, looking at compatibility. And do you know when those 2 planners went to City Hall, they got beat up there because they had agreed with the community, and they actually stated some of the tools that they had learned, and that this was right. And the city staff gave them, a hard time, but we got it passed. But the planner, he couldn't take it anymore. He says, you know what, I can't work in a city like this, and he left. The other one transferred to another department. He said he wanted to get out of the planning department altogether. So I think there's still that institutional barrier, that institutional racism barrier within the staff that wants to keep the status quo. And you have new people with fresh minds that say, no, it should be different. And we were very blessed to have those 2 planners to work with us, because I don't think without them we could have rezoned over. We made history by rezoning 600 properties that were more compatible with the community. Mm-hmm. Oh.
What was the basis of the City of Austin's disapproval of that, of the proposed plan by the planners? What was the basis of
Well, they really didn't have the basis. They were just fighting why did they downzone, because they did a lot of downzoning. And so they just felt like if you got rid of a lot of that industrial zoning, then where were the jobs going to be? You know, kind of stuff like that. Okay. Well,
Last time, our first city forum, I mentioned that this semester, this year, we're taking a new approach by asking students or your input in terms of who would like to invite and what topics would like to, or you'd like to hear, and you give us feedback. It's so great, and we have it's a great speaker today, great topic. I think to me it's a very enlightening lecture to to learn about what the true story or the may call it dark side of our planning practice, zoning practice that we rarely heard or learned, say, from textbooks. And I also think it's a great just lecture, possibly for courses like land use planning or planning law or historical preservation and others. So many thanks to you for your recommendations, for your suggestions. So thank you, Aisha, for coordinating this and our recording team. And of course, many thanks to Lisa.
Thank you. And,
Almanza.
yeah. Thank you.